Hello and welcome. Heavy fighting is continuing along the front line where the Ukrainians make some slight advances. We have videos from the Russian attacks on Ukrainian crewed boats on the Black Sea. And just as I finished the research for this episode, breaking news came in. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader and nominally founder of the Wagner PMC, might be dead. He might have been killed when his private jet crashed, likely being shot down. This and more in this situational report. We'll start initially with reports from Russia themselves. We have news here about another air attack by the Ukrainians on Moscow. What you can see in the background, you could see the flashes in the inner city of Moscow. Ukrainian drones were hitting were striking targets again. According to the Russians, they not just Moscow, but also Bryansk and Belgorod were attacked, the oblasts at least, as well as on the Crimean Peninsula. So the Ukrainian drones are continuing to attack Russian targets. I found a Russian source claiming that I think 6 days in a row Moscow was now attacked. Let's directly switch to the eastern front line. North here at Sinkivka, the fighting is continuing. The Russians are claiming they are gaining ground around the town. They seem to have advanced in this area here, and the fighting is continuing in the forested area. They might have been reaching this area by now, from what I saw in geolocalized pictures, but they have not captured the town yet. Ukrainians did counterattack along this line here in the area, but I cannot confirm that they have achieved anything. The Russians have struck several bridges over the Oskil, though. The bridges along this river to obviously cut off the Ukrainian lines of communication to diminish their supply and thus having an easier way, while the Ukrainians try to set up ways to cross the river regardless. Further south, fighting is continuing around Torske and the Serebryansk forest as well. I have reports about heavy fighting, not though about anything changing in the control of territory. At Berchivka, the Ukrainians were attacking. The front line should actually be roughly around here. I cannot confirm that the Ukrainians were successful. The Russians attacked at Klishivka and at Kurdyumivka. They failed with those attacks, and the Ukrainians attacked in Klishivka, and supposedly they gained some ground. I read reports about this, and this is a pro-Ukrainian blogger. So just because he says that doesn't mean that much, even though he seems to be fairly reliable. But according to him, they pushed in. This is Klishivka, and this would be where they pushed the Russians back recently. I have conflicting reports, but it seems like the Ukrainians were gaining some ground inside of Klishivka. Further south around Avdiivka, we have the fighting is continuing. We have Russian attacks in Avdiivka, in Marinka, and at Novomikhailivka. The Ukrainians supposedly attacked around Avdiivka. Where exactly, I do not know. And at Novomikhailivka, again, no successes by either side. The Ukrainians also attacked at Mikilske and at Pavlivka around Vuhledar. No advance in this direction. And there are Ukrainian attacks reported southeast of Robotyne. They try to advance in this direction here, but they have not succeeded in the last few days since the liberation of Robotyne. West of it, the Ukrainians are trying to cut off this advance here further north between Prigozhin and Staromayorsk. They are slowly advancing along the tree lines here, and there is some worry in the community of the Russian mill bloggers that their units up here could be cut off. If that is a serious danger, and if it's considered by the Russian commanders as well, we should expect a retreat from that advance here fairly soon. I think it's Lech or Bulge, I guess, from that Bulge fairly soon. Further west along the Oblast, further west at Orikhiv, we have interesting reports. Robotyne is still not fully liberated, at least I cannot confirm it. But the interesting part is the Ukrainian side has made these pictures here public, which are civilians evacuated from Robotyne. You see mostly old women that were evacuated here. And the interesting part was that there were actually still civilians in Robotyne, despite heavy fighting in and around the town for almost 3 months as of now. They were still in there, and now they got evacuated by the Ukrainians and brought into safety, at least those. We also have reports about ongoing attacks by both sides. Russian counterattacks and Ukrainian attacks. Both sides claim successes. So the Russians claim in their counterattacks they gained some positions, whereas the Ukrainians claim that they slowly advance. It seems to me that at this very moment, Robotyne is not liberated yet, but it should be happening fairly soon, as the Ukrainians have advanced further south, and it's more or less only the last few houses that are still contested. So we should expect Robotyne to be liberated somewhat soon, especially as the Ukrainians keep up the pressure south here and obviously are threatening to envelop the units in Robotyne to cut them off, and then in that case the Russians will have no choice but to withdraw. Over the further west, not really any news from Piatry-Khatki, and on the Dnipro and the Dnipro Delta and the islands here, the usual thing. Both sides report commando activity, small boats ferrying troops, small landings here. They strike those units with artillery, with FPV drones, but nothing much has changed that I can confirm. Generally, along the front line, we have reports that the Russians now have 45,000 men as the Ukrainians say, in the Crimean Liman axis. So more or less, I guess, in this area here alone, according to the Ukrainians, the Russians have 45,000 soldiers, 500 MBTs and IFVs, more than 300 artillery pieces, and 150 MLRS, so rocket artillery, only here in the area of Crimean being concentrated. And we have further south, we have the reports that the Ukrainians are along the front line here. We have reports by the Russians that the Ukrainians are chasing them with FPV drones far beyond the front line. We talked about this in the past, and we have the battalion Vostok. That should be a DNR unit, if I'm not completely wrong. And they say that 5 to 7 kilometers along the front line, they are suffering losses because the Ukrainians keep striking them. We also have a video here, a picture and video from TASS, the Russian news agency, that shows that has a report about escorts for supply convoys. And this is interesting in several parts, as it shows that there must be a serious threat on the ground behind the front line, indicating either commando activity or partisan activity. It starts with some cars driving 2 hours ahead of the convoy to identify IEDs, explosives planted along the route, and then escort for the units itself. They talk about air attacks and DRGs. Unfortunately, I can't identify what DRGs means. Whether that's supposed to be partisans or drones, unfortunately, I cannot really confirm this here. We have reports that the Russians continue building their fortifications behind the front line. This is 20 kilometers away from the front line, and they are still adding fortifications all the time, and they have actually increased the tempo of the fortifications. We have the same here. According to this was satellite, but this is the Ukrainians themselves claiming that among that they are establishing 3 defensive lines on the Perekop Isthmus. This is the land bridge, the land connection on the Crimean Peninsula, according to which the Russians themselves are still afraid that the Ukrainians might break through. So while we can talk a lot about weaknesses from the Ukrainian side, about unmet expectations, about heavy losses, the Russians themselves still seem to be worried that this is far from over and that the Ukrainians might actually break through. So everyone rooting for the Ukrainian side, the Russians basically should give you some hope in this regard. We have more informations about the morale here. This is a longer article by Anastasia Kashevarova. I mentioned her a couple of times in the past, a Russian military blogger. I'll more or less scroll through, and you can pause it in case you want to read it yourself. So she's basically saying that light vehicles are still scarce, and that civilians and recruited soldiers have to hand over their cars. They are getting harassed by the military police and the officers. And one of the interesting summaries is that the Russian soldiers are saying they are at war with the enemy, but their officers are at war with themselves, with the Russian units, and that should be an indication in regards to not just lack of logistics abilities, but also should be a bad thing regarding the morale of the Russian soldiers. But obviously we can find some claims, at least in this regard, by the Ukrainians themselves. I just want to mention that the Ukrainian president himself talked how unacceptable the situation was in the military recruitment offices. So both sides have serious issues. This is a good sign in regards to the Ukrainians, because it shows that the Russians have serious problems, but we should not overstate this as the Russians are about to break because their morale is gone. That would be definitely too much. We have information here from the Zaporizhzhia power plant. This shows us that the Russians have repainted everything to make it clear that they now control it. Okay, if they insist on doing that. And we have informations from the Crimea. Here is a video from the Ukrainians destroying a Russian air defense system. It was identified as S-400. I am showing it here, and the interesting part is that the Ukrainians were able to record it while it was being destroyed. Now this was here, so the Ukrainians were able to strike them down here and having drones above it. I found something from Riba in this regard which was fairly interesting. They claim that the air defense system might have been destroyed with a brimstone missile from one of the small boats that were attacked close by. I mentioned it in yesterday's situational picture, and we'll come to that in a few moments, because we even have videos from those attacks on those boats that it might have been from there, and that would explain where the missile would come from. Because to strike an air defense system down here, which should be out of range for the HIMARS, the regular HIMARS missiles. So it would more or less require a domestic system from the Ukrainians or a Storm Shadow missile. And that against just an S-400 didn't make too much sense to me. But if it was a brimstone missile from a boat roughly operating in this area, then it would explain the overall situation. Then it would explain it very well. Riba is also claiming that it was not an S-300, but not an S-400, but actually an S-300. I have not visually confirmed either in this regard. We have reports from the GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence. According to them, the Russians are sinking ferries in the Strait of Kerch to then connect them with each other to create a barrier to protect the bridge of Kerch from further attacks along the water. That was to be expected, that they would do this at some point, but the Ukrainians are already finding something else to threaten them with, and we'll come to that at a little point later. We have now videos from the Black Sea. This is actually published by the Russians, showing obviously a gun camera from a Russian fighter jet. This is the fast maneuvering boat, and as we can see, the Russian jets attacked them with their cannons. According to the Ukrainians, initially they launched a missile, but the missile missed and fell into the ocean, and now you can see them striking them with their cannons. According to the Russians, they sunk them, but then we have these videos here, which show us that apparently, if they are connected, obviously, they can't be sunk, because otherwise, where would the pictures come from? How would the picture have reached the Ukrainian side? Obviously, it is claimed that this is in connection. I have not seen the video before, but it might very well be from another point. We see the Ukrainians launching a manpad at a plane here, and supposedly this was the Ukrainians defeating against it. And here we have a small overview of the boat itself. Also here the automatic grenade launcher that is constructed on top of it. Let me quickly zoom forward. I think it is the same once more here. So it's showing more or less the same twice. We have now another video, and this is showing the smaller boats, actually 4 of the boats next to a gas offshore platform. And this was what supposed to happen. This was, according to what the Russians said, fairly close to where then the air defense system was destroyed. And according to Riba is reporting that the Ukrainians not just have manpads, as we can see here now, being fired at something. So the drone was Ukrainian, which observed it, but the jet attacked the boats and apparently either didn't see the drone or prioritized the boats. And according to Riba, those boats not just have manpads, but they also carry brimstones. And in that case, a brimstone would have been used against the air defense systems. Now we have a message from Germany. This is the public television saying that a Russian journalist in exile was supposedly, was likely poisoned. The story that she was in Munich to go to the consulate of Ukraine to get a visa, and on her way there she met and had lunch with a friend in the open, and several acquaintances appeared, which was like weird because how would she meet all of them? She couldn't finish because the food was so horrible, and on her way back she felt really sick, and it's still not clear what caused her sickness. But the parliamentarian responsible for the intelligence agencies is still not excluding that she was poisoned. And in that case, obviously, the guess would be that it was the Russian government doing this on German soil. And now we come to the message some of you might have awaited. This is the VCHK OGPU channel. I mentioned it a couple of times. It is well connected in the Russian military intelligence. And we had the information that a Russian jet was shot down. Let me quickly take the video here. This video is showing the jet coming down. And as you can see, it's tumbling. The later reports are that it lost a wing and its stabilizers and crashed to the ground like this. We see it coming down here. And it really seems to be in not having both of its wings anymore. It's obviously crashing to the ground. We hear a big explosion and we see it. And you see the people running forward and then going to the fence to see it. Now, according to first reports, this was Prigozhin's jet. As said, unfortunately, when starting to record this video, I couldn't research anymore. But we have Riba here mentioning that they identified the number of his plane on the wreckage. So supposedly it was his plane. But according to some reports, the fallen aboard belonged to Yevgeny Prigozhin. We have then Voenko saying that belonging to Yevgeny Prigozhin, Voenko was already confirming that it's his jet and it was carrying 3 crew members and up to 7 passengers. But whether Prigozhin himself was on board is unknown. It's his plane, but it was shot down, and we have the messages that it's crashed there. So the plane seems to be clearly identified as Prigozhin's. So far, it was unclear whether or not he was on board. Before I finished, I found a message that according to TASS, the Russian Civil Aviation Ministry, I think, or authority said that Prigozhin was on board. I was not able to confirm it before I finished this. So just to be clear, this is basically breaking news. It might turn out that this is a plane of somebody else. It might turn out that Prigozhin was on board. It might turn out that he wasn't, because a day before, a video appeared from him from Mali. It might have been that it was just his plane moving around and it was shot down to intimidate him. We simply don't know. There might be a rational and a non-explosive reasoning for that, even though we have here this channel again, and they're saying, according to them, 2 explosions sounded in the sky. So either it was shot down with an air defense system or it had explosives on board to blow it up. As said, unfortunately, I had to do the video at some point because I'm about to do my German live stream, and I couldn't wait until I have more information. But it seems likely that Prigozhin was either killed or at least was sent a message that there should be no doubt that he receives it. Obviously, in the next situational picture, we'll probably talk more about this. Let's continue. This here we have the other big news for today was that a Russian helicopter who has landed in Ukraine a while ago was apparently a Russian pilot defecting. It's now being said that he was in contact with the GUR, with the Ukrainian military intelligence, who rescued his family and evacuated it from Russia. And on board were 2 other Russian soldiers who were neutralized. I don't know if the pilot himself killed them or if the Ukrainians killed them, but this one managed to defect and bring his helicopter with him. We have news about the support international one after the Netherlands. Now Denmark has also promised F-16s. They promised 19, but not all at once. If I remember it correctly, it was a few coming each year until 2025. So the 19 will only be full in 2025, in 2.5 years, more or less. And we have another fire in Russia, this time at at another plant here inside, deep inside of Russia. As they themselves said, Russia's most diversified producer of, what was it? Of specialty steels and alloys, which are probably fairly needed in the current situation. Obviously, it could be a mistake, an accident. It could be overworked workers or untrained workers trying to increase the output, or it could be another example of sabotage. It seems at least that the fires are increasing since the war has begun, but obviously that could be selective, us simply focusing more on what's happening in Russia. We also have this here. This is what Ukraine will start frightening the Russians with now. An underwater drone, and as it seems to be fairly massive, that the Ukrainians will likely start using against Russian ships and against the Kerch Bridge. At least that's what we would expect here. It was presented here and then released into the water. Obviously far bigger than a torpedo, so the warhead might be much, much bigger and strike at the foundation of potential bridges. This will open new ways of attacks for the Ukrainians, so just blocking off the surface will no longer suffice. The interesting or the amusing part here is the Ukrainians don't even have to build a lot of them. By showing these pictures, they already forced the Russians to react. They forced the Russians to start anti-submarine warfare, more or less, despite the Ukrainians not having a single submarine anymore. They already forced the Russians to employ resources that they could use otherwise. And finally, something that is more amusing and doesn't really have anything to do with it, but in Iran there was an arms fair and delegations from various countries were there, and this was the North Korean delegate, and I guess the brass inside of North Korea has different requirements when it comes to military firearms than the rest of the world. At least that's what he seems to be indicating in this regard. Anyways, that was it from me for now. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the thumbs up button. It really helps with the algorithm, and leave comments what you think about the current Prigozhin event. Maybe you have some updates that I haven't mentioned yet, then please leave them in the comment section for the rest of us to see. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. And that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.